The 1970s were a time of glitz, but behind the charm, some British icons despised the common man. Today, we expose 10 stars who treated the public with absolute disdain. From humiliating fans to ignoring staff, their arrogance was shocking. Please subscribe and tell us in the comments, does talent excuse bad manners? Watch until the very end as the final story reveals a national treasure who secretly loathed the working class. Let us uncover the dark truth behind the fame. Peter Sellers. The 1970s were undeniably the decade of Peter Sellers. To the world, he was the bumbling and lovable Inspector Clouseau, a man who could make millions laugh with a simple trip over a rug. However, the reality behind the cameras was far darker and incredibly tragic for anyone who had the misfortune of serving him. By the mid-70s, his ego had inflated to a size that barely fit within the film studios. He did not just demand perfection, he demanded absolute submission from those he considered beneath him. Sellers possessed a volatile temperament that could shift from charm to icy rage in a split second, often triggered by the smallest inconveniences caused by drivers, waiters, or assistants. He genuinely believed that he was operating on a higher plane of existence compared to the working-class crew members who facilitated his stardom. During the filming of The Pink Panther Strikes Again in 1976, his relationship with the entire production team was so toxic that he barely spoke to director Blake Edwards. He would lock himself in his trailer, refusing to come out for hours while hundreds of extras and crew members waited in the cold. To him, their time was irrelevant. He viewed the common people on set as mere props, tools to be used and discarded, rather than human beings with lives and feelings. If a runner brought him tea at the wrong temperature, they could face a tirade of verbal humiliation that left them in tears. His disdain extended to his loyal fans as well. While many stars of the era understood that signing autographs was part of the job, Sellers often looked at admirers with sheer contempt. He famously hated being approached in public by people expecting him to be funny. If a fan approached him in a restaurant, expecting a smile, they were often met with a cold, dead stare or a sharp dismissal. He felt that the public owned his characters, but they had no right to him as a person. This arrogance was rooted in a deep psychological complex. He often claimed he had no personality of his own, and perhaps to fill that void, he projected a superiority that alienated everyone. The luxury he surrounded himself with in the 70s served as a fortress against the common man. He would spend money with reckless abandon on cars, gadgets, and yachts, discarding them as quickly as he discarded people. He once famously ordered a helper to repaint a brand new Rolls-Royce because he decided he disliked the shade of blue after seeing it for 5 minutes. This wastefulness in a time of economic hardship for Britain showed just how disconnected he was from reality. He lived in a bubble of privilege where the word no did not exist, and anyone who dared to utter it was cut out of his life permanently. By the end of the decade, despite his massive box office success, Peter Sellers was a man alone in a crowd. He had burned bridges with almost every friend and colleague who had helped him rise. His hatred for the mundane and the ordinary people who populated the real world left him isolated in his ivory tower. He passed away shortly after the decade turned, leaving behind a legacy of brilliant comedy, but also a trail of hurt feelings and stories of a man who looked down on the very people who made him a star. He was a genius, certainly, but a genius who had lost his humanity along the way to the top. Kenneth Williams. While the nation roared with laughter at the Carry On films throughout the 1970s, the man at the center of the mirth was silently seething. Kenneth Williams was the face of British comedy, known for his flaring nostrils and camp catchphrases. Yet, he viewed the very audience that paid his wages with a mixture of fear and absolute revulsion. He famously referred to the adoring public as the Great Unwashed, a term that was not meant affectionately in the slightest. To him, the fans who approached him on the high street were not supporters to be cherished, but walking bacteria that threatened his obsessive cleanliness. Dining in public with Kenneth was a navigational minefield. If a waiter dared to have dirty fingernails, or if a fan interrupted his meal with a polite request for a signature, the reaction was often visceral. He would recoil as if physically struck, his face twisting into a sneer of genuine disgust. In his private diaries, which serve as a chronicle of his misery during the 70s, he documented these encounters with venomous ink. He described ordinary people in the most grotesque terms, fixating on their smells, their bad teeth, or their cheap clothing. It was a cruel irony that a man who became a millionaire by playing to the working class found their presence so utterly intolerable. His arrogance was partly a defense mechanism, but it manifested as cruel snobbery. During the production of his films in the mid-1970s, he kept a strict distance from the lower-level crew. While other cast members might share a joke with the lighting technicians or the makeup artists, Williams would retreat to his dressing room, scrubbing his hands and complaining about the vulgarity of the set. He believed himself to be an intellectual trapped in a low-brow world, forced to clown for people he considered his intellectual inferiors. He despised the lack of decorum in modern Britain and felt that the 70s were ushering in an age of rudeness, failing to see that he was often the rudest person in the room. This hatred for the common man extended even to his specific living arrangements. He lived in a central London flat near Great Portland Street, not to be in the heart of the action, but to build a fortress against it. He would peer out of his window at the crowds below, judging them with a critical eye. When he did venture out, he walked with a brisk pace, eyes fixed ahead, radiating an aura of "do not touch me." If someone did manage to corner him, he would often use big words and a haughty tone to belittle them, leaving the fan confused and humiliated. He took a strange pleasure in making others feel small, perhaps to inflate his own fragile sense of worth. By the late 1970s, his disdain had left him incredibly isolated. He had pushed away those who tried to get close, convinced that they were all after something or simply too coarse for his refined sensibilities. The tragedy of Kenneth Williams was that he desperately wanted to be loved, but he could not stand the people who offered that love. He spent his evenings alone, writing in his diary about the ghastly people he had encountered, unaware that his own inability to connect with the common man was the source of his profound unhappiness. He was a national treasure who wished the nation would simply leave him alone. Alec Guinness. Sir Alec Guinness entered the 1970s as a titan of the British stage and a serious character actor, respected for his intellect and subtlety. However, by the end of the decade, he had become a global icon for a role he secretly despised, and this newfound fame among the masses revealed a deep-seated snobbery. When he took the role of Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars in 1977, he viewed the entire production as fairy tale rubbish. While he was professional enough to deliver a great performance, his private letters from the set revealed his true feelings. He described the dialogue as excruciating and the film as banality, looking down on the science fiction genre as something beneath a man of his stature. He was an actor of Shakespeare and Dickens, and he felt humiliated to be playing second fiddle to a hairy Wookiee and a beeping robot. His disdain for the project turned into a genuine antipathy for the audience it attracted. Unlike other stars who embraced the love of the younger generation, Guinness found the obsession of his new fans to be disturbing and pathetic. There is a legendary story that perfectly encapsulates his attitude toward the common fan. A young boy once approached him in London, shaking with excitement, and told the great actor that he had watched Star Wars over 100 times. Instead of thanking the child, Guinness looked at him with a weary, judgmental eye. He agreed to give the boy an autograph on one strict condition, that the boy promise never to watch the film again. The child burst into tears, crushed by his hero. To Guinness, this was a necessary lesson. He believed he was saving the boy from mind-numbing entertainment, failing to see the cruelty in his actions. This was not an isolated incident, but rather a pattern of behavior that defined his later years. He famously hated opening fan mail, often complaining about the sheer volume of letters from what he considered to be simple-minded people. He felt that the adoration of the masses was a burden, a sticky substance that he could not wash off. While he was happy to accept the massive financial checks that came from his 2% back-end deal on the film, which made him a multimillionaire, he wanted nothing to do with the people who bought the tickets. He viewed the modern pop culture of the late 70s as a sign of intellectual decay, and he resented that his face was printed on lunchboxes and plastic toys sold in supermarkets. His interactions with the public were often marked by a cold, distant politeness that barely concealed his irritation. If someone approached him in a restaurant to praise his work in the space opera, he would often feign ignorance or give a curt nod before turning his back. He refused to engage in the shared joy of the phenomenon. He believed that an actor should be mysterious and separate from the audience, maintaining a barrier that no ordinary person should cross. He missed the days when theatergoers were quiet and respectful, not the screaming hordes of the blockbuster era. He felt that the dignity of his profession had been stripped away by the commercialism of the decade. Ultimately, Alec Guinness lived in a paradox of his own making. He was sustained by the money of the common people he looked down upon. He spent the rest of his life trying to distance himself from the role that made him a household name, often refusing to talk about it in interviews. He died a wealthy man, but one who remained eternally baffled and disgusted by the specific nature of his own celebrity. He was a man of high culture who found himself trapped in a low culture world, and he never forgave the public for loving him for the wrong reasons. His legacy is one of immense talent, but also of a chilling detachment from the human beings who admired him most. John Cleese. In the 1970s, John Cleese was the undisputed king of British comedy, the tall, manic genius behind Monty Python and Fawlty Towers. On screen, he played characters who were often frustrated by the incompetence of others, most notably the rude hotelier Basil Fawlty. The uncomfortable truth that emerged throughout the decade was that the line between Basil and John was thinner than anyone realized. Cleese did not just act out frustration, he lived it. He harbored a genuine intellectual superiority complex that made him intolerant of anyone he deemed slow, stupid, or inefficient. To him, the average person was a disappointment, an obstacle to a smoothly run life. His interactions with the general public were frequently tense. While filming on location or traveling, he was known to be prickly and unapproachable. He did not suffer fools gladly, and unfortunately, his definition of a fool was quite broad. If a fan asked a question he considered inane, he would not simply ignore it. He would often deconstruct the stupidity of the question to the person's face, using his sharp wit as a weapon. This wasn't playful banter, it was a dressing down from a former Cambridge scholar who felt he was surrounded by idiots. He valued logic and precision above all else, and the messy, emotional, and often irrational nature of the common man was something he found deeply irritating. This disdain was not limited to random encounters, it extended to the service industry, much like his famous character. There were reports of him losing his temper in restaurants and hotels if the service did not meet his exacting standards. He expected perfection and efficiency, and when the human element failed, his patience evaporated. He viewed incompetence not as a simple mistake, but as a personal affront. He famously struggled with the pressures of fame, finding the constant attention of the public to be an intrusion on his privacy. He believed that because he had provided the entertainment, the transaction was complete and the public had no further claim on his time or energy. During the 70s, his interviews often revealed a man who was deeply cynical about British society. He saw a nation in decline, filled with people who lacked ambition and intellect. He would often speak about the mediocrity of the masses, positioning himself as an observer looking down at a chaotic ant farm. This attitude alienated him from the working-class roots of comedy. While other comedians thrived on the warmth of the audience, Cleese seemed to prefer the cold comfort of being right. He was a perfectionist who created comedy gold from his own intolerance, but that same intolerance made him a difficult figure to love off-screen. By the end of the decade, Cleese was moving away from the chaotic collaboration of Python towards more controlled solo projects. This shift was partly driven by his desire to control his environment and minimize his exposure to the unpredictability of others. He remained a brilliant writer and performer, but his relationship with the simple, everyday people who made up his audience remained strained. He was the stern schoolmaster of British comedy, tapping his watch and scowling at the class, convinced that if everyone would just be a little bit smarter, like him, the world would be a bearable place. His genius was undeniable, but it came wrapped in a layer of prickly arrogance that kept the common man firmly at arm's length. Princess Margaret. In the 1970s, Princess Margaret was the ultimate symbol of royal snobbery, a woman who made it abundantly clear that she viewed the rest of the human race as her inferiors. While her sister, the Queen, built a reputation on duty and stoicism, Margaret became infamous for her hedonistic lifestyle and her absolute refusal to compromise her comfort for anyone. She spent much of the decade on the private island of Mustique, partying with the elite while Britain suffered through economic crises and strikes. To the working-class families struggling back home, her lavish holidays and blatant disregard for public optics were a slap in the face. She did not just live in a different world, she lived in a different universe where the needs of the common man were simply invisible to her. Her treatment of those she considered beneath her was nothing short of psychological warfare. She demanded absolute obedience and terrified her staff. There are numerous accounts from the 70s of her treating footmen not as humans, but as mobile furniture. She would famously demand that people continue drinking and listening to her play the piano until the early hours of the morning, forbidding anyone to leave the room or go to bed before she did. Exhausted guests and servants would stand on their feet for hours, afraid to sit or speak, while she chain smoked and drank whiskey. If someone bored her, she would simply cut them dead with a look of icy contempt or turn her back on them mid-sentence, a gesture of dismissal that was crushing coming from a royal. She often mingled with the biggest celebrities of the era, from Mick Jagger to Peter Sellers, yet she never let them forget that they were merely court jesters in her presence. She viewed the new money stars of the 1970s as vulgar and unpolished. She notoriously told the supermodel Twiggy, who came from a working-class background, that she was unfortunate-looking during a dinner party. She had a sharp, acid tongue and took pleasure in dismantling people's confidence. She believed that her royal blood gave her a license to be rude, and she used the word common as the ultimate insult. To Margaret, being common was a sin, a moral failing that justified her disdain. She surrounded herself with sycophants who were too afraid to tell her the truth. Her official engagements often revealed her deep boredom with the public. While other royals mastered the art of small talk and feigned interest, Margaret frequently looked irritated and impatient. She hated being touched by strangers and would physically recoil if a member of the crowd got too close. She famously complained about the smell of wet paint and the dullness of factory visits. She wanted the privileges of royalty, the palaces, the jewelry, the bowing and scraping, without the responsibility of actually caring for the people. She treated her royal duties as a tiresome burden that interrupted her social calendar. This attitude alienated her from the British public, who began to see her as a parasite on the state. By the end of the 1970s, her popularity had plummeted. Her divorce in 1978 stripped away some of the mystique, revealing a lonely and unhappy woman behind the arrogance. However, even in her lowest moments, she never dropped the mask of superiority. She remained the Countess of Snowdon, the sister of the monarch, and she clung to her status like a lifeline. She was a tragic figure who demanded respect rather than earning it, and who died without ever understanding why the common people she despised did not adore her in return. She was the embodiment of an outdated class system, a relic who refused to believe that all people are created equal. Sid Vicious. The punk explosion of the late 1970s brought a new kind of star, the anti-hero who spat in the face of society. At the forefront was Sid Vicious, the bass player for the Sex Pistols, who took the band's anarchic image and turned it into a personal philosophy of hatred. Unlike other rock stars who might have been snobs in private, Sid's disdain for the public was performative, violent, and utterly chaotic. He didn't just look down on the common man, he physically attacked them. At concerts, he was known to spit into the crowd, swing his bass guitar at fans, and dive into the audience with fists flying. He viewed the people who paid to see him not as supporters, but as targets for his aggression, a faceless mass of normality that he wanted to destroy. His behavior offstage was equally abhorrent to the average person. Wandering the streets of London in 1977, he was a walking disaster zone. He treated service workers, taxi drivers, and passers-by with a sneering arrogance, fueled by a potent mix of drugs and a desperate need for attention. He wore a swastika t-shirt not out of political ideology, but purely for shock value, knowing it would horrify the generation that had fought in the war. This was the ultimate insult to the British working class, many of whom had lost family members fighting fascism. Sid didn't care about history or respect. He only cared about the reaction he could provoke. He was a nihilist who believed in nothing, and he treated the people around him as nothing. His relationship with his own fans was toxic. He often mocked them for buying into the punk fashion, calling them sheep and posers. He felt that by idolizing him, they were proving their own stupidity. He was a creation of Malcolm McLaren, a fashion accessory with a bad attitude, but Sid believed his own hype. He thought he was the ultimate rebel, above the laws and morals that governed ordinary people. This arrogance led him to treat everyone, including his friends and bandmates, with a callous disregard. He was unpredictable and dangerous, a ticking time bomb who made everyone in his vicinity walk on eggshells. He had no empathy, no gratitude, and no sense of connection to the human race. The tragedy of Sid Vicious was that his hatred for the common man was really a projection of his self-loathing. He was a young man with limited talent who had been thrust into the spotlight and told to act like a monster. He played the role so well that it consumed him. He alienated the very people he claimed to represent, the disenfranchised youth of Britain. Instead of being a voice for the voiceless, he became a caricature of a thug. His violent outbursts and drug-induced stupors made him a figure of pity and revulsion rather than admiration. He was a star who burned brightly with the fuel of negativity, leaving nothing but scorched earth behind him. By the time of his death in 1979, he had become a cautionary tale. He had murdered his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen, and died of an overdose, alone and miserable. The working-class kids who had once cheered for him had grown up and moved on, realizing that his rebellion was hollow. Sid Vicious died as he lived, disconnected, angry, and ultimately, a victim of his own inability to find any worth in the world or the people in it. He was the icon of a movement that screamed no future, and he made sure that for him and for anyone who got too close, that prophecy came true. He was the star who hated everyone, including himself. Edward Heath. Edward Heath, the Prime Minister from 1970 to 1974, was a man of profound intellect and musical talent, but he was disastrously ill-suited for the human side of politics. In an era that demanded a common touch, Heath was an iceberg. He was the son of a carpenter and a maid, a true working-class success story, yet he spent his entire adult life running away from his roots. He adopted a plummy accent, which famously elongated vowels in a strange way, and surrounded himself with classical music and yachting, hobbies that were alien to the average voter. He did not just fail to connect with the common man, he seemed to actively resent the necessity of trying. His interactions with the public were legendary for their awkwardness. During election campaigns, he would walk through markets or factories looking as if he had landed on an alien planet. He stiffened when people tried to shake his hand and often responded to friendly greetings with a grunt or a silence that was deafening. He lacked the basic social lubricant of small talk. If a constituent told him about their struggles with rising prices or strikes, Heath would lecture them on economic theory rather than offering sympathy. He believed that he was right, and if the public didn't understand his policies, it was because they were not intelligent enough to grasp the complexities of governance. He viewed the electorate as a problem to be managed, not a people to be served. This arrogance was most visible during the industrial unrest that defined his time in office. His confrontation with the miners was not just political, it was personal. He viewed the unions not as representatives of working people fighting for better wages, but as enemies of the state who needed to be crushed. His famous question, "Who governs Britain?" was a challenge to the working class, and the answer they gave him at the ballot box was a resounding, "Not you." He could not comprehend why the people would choose chaos over his logical, if cold, leadership. He sat in number 10 Downing Street, conducting imaginary orchestras, while the lights went out across the country, completely detached from the misery of families sitting in the dark. Even within his own party, he was known as the Grocer, a nickname meant to mock his lower middle-class origins, yet he was the one who acted the most like a haughty aristocrat. He treated his colleagues with the same disdain he showed the public. He was known to turn his back on people he disliked and refused to speak to them for years. He held grudges with a tenacity that was almost impressive. After losing the leadership to Margaret Thatcher in 1975, he spent the rest of the decade sulking on the backbenches. He became known as the Incredible Sulk, a man consumed by bitterness because the party and the country had rejected his genius. Edward Heath ended the 70s as a lonely figure. He never married, had few close friends, and his only true love seemed to be his yacht, Morning Cloud. He was a man who preferred the company of the open sea to the company of his fellow human beings. He died believing that history would vindicate him, but for those who lived through his tenure, he remained the prime minister who looked down his nose at the nation. He was a man who climbed the ladder of social mobility only to pull it up after him, refusing to look back at the people he left behind. His tragedy was that he wanted to lead a country he did not actually like, Rex Harrison. Rex Harrison, the star of My Fair Lady, carried an air of aristocratic charm that captivated audiences worldwide. However, the man behind the tuxedo was widely considered to be one of the most detestable figures in the history of British entertainment. By the 1970s, his patience with the general public had evaporated completely. He did not merely dislike fame, he loathed the people who facilitated it. He treated his fans with a level of cruelty that was shocking even to his hardened Hollywood peers. If an admirer dared to approach him for an autograph while he was dining or walking, they risked being verbally eviscerated. He would often scream at them to go away, using language that would make a sailor blush, shattering the illusion of the gentleman instantly. His treatment of service staff was legendary for all the wrong reasons. He viewed waiters, drivers, and porters as an underclass that existed solely to be barked at. He would snap his fingers for attention and send back food or wine on a whim, purely to assert dominance over the staff. There are stories of him reducing waitresses to tears because the ice in his drink was the wrong shape or the tablecloth was not crisp enough. He behaved like a feudal lord wandering through the 20th century, genuinely believing that the working class were there to serve his every caprice. He never said please, and he certainly never said thank you. To him, gratitude was a weakness, and politeness was something he reserved only for those he considered his equals, a very small circle indeed. During his theater runs in the 70s, the stage door became a zone of terror. While other actors would graciously sign programs and chat with the crowd braving the rain, Harrison would storm past them, eyes fixed ahead, radiating pure hostility. On one famous occasion, he allegedly took a pen offered by a fan, threw it into the gutter, and stepped into his waiting limousine without a word. He despised the tactile nature of fandom. He hated being touched or breathed on by the masses. He referred to the audiences who filled the theaters as cattle, a source of revenue but not of respect. He felt that his performance on stage was the gift, and any demand for his personal time afterwards was an impertinence. This hatred stemmed from a colossal ego that allowed no room for empathy. He was known as Sexy Rexy, a nickname he reveled in, but his relationships with women were just as transactional and cruel as his relationship with the public. He was a tax exile for much of the 70s, living a life of luxury while complaining bitterly about the state of Britain and its people. He felt the country had declined because the working classes were getting above their station. He missed the deference of the pre-war era, where a star was a god and the public knew their place, which was on their knees. He viewed the democratization of society in the 70s as a personal affront to his dignity. By the time he reached old age, Rex Harrison had alienated almost everyone. His memorial service was attended by many, but the stories told in private were rarely affectionate. He was a man who had everything: talent, money, looks, and fame. But he lacked the basic human capacity for kindness. He died as he lived, a solitary figure on a pedestal of his own making, looking down with a sneer at the world below. He remains the ultimate example of the star who loved the applause but hated the hands that clapped. His legacy is a reminder that you can be a knight of the realm and a king of the box office, but without humility, you are simply a rich bully. Arthur Lowe. To the British public in the 1970s, Arthur Lowe was the beloved Captain Mainwaring of Dad's Army, the pompous but ultimately brave bank manager who led the Home Guard. The nation laughed at his social climbing antics, believing it to be a brilliant caricature. The uncomfortable truth, however, was that Lowe was not acting. He was, in reality, far more snobbish and imperious than the character he played. He viewed himself as a serious theatrical actor of the old school, and he looked upon the medium of television sitcoms with a distinct sense of disdain. He famously forbade the cast from bringing their scripts into his home, stating that he would not have such rubbish in his house. This was not a joke. It was a genuine reflection of how he viewed the work that made him a household name. His relationship with his fellow cast members was defined by a self-imposed segregation. While the rest of the platoon, John Le Mesurier, Clive Dunn, and Bill Pertwee, would socialize, drink, and laugh together after filming, Lowe would frequently isolate himself. He considered himself a cut above the rest, particularly the actors with backgrounds in music hall or variety, whom he viewed as mere comics rather than artists. He would retreat to his dressing room or his private yacht, the Amazon, which he kept moored nearby. On his boat, He played the role of the Grand Commodore, expecting his guests and crew to follow strict naval etiquette. He created a floating world where he was the unquestioned commander, safe from the chaotic and vulgar democracy of the real world. His attitude towards the general public was one of prickly intolerance. He detested the familiarity that fame brought. If a fan approached him on the street and shouted his famous catchphrase, "You stupid boy," Lowe would not smile or wave. He would stop, glare at the offender with icy disapproval, and often deliver a lecture on manners. He found the adoration of the working class to be an intrusion on his privacy. He believed that an actor's job ended the moment the director shouted, "Cut," and he resented the expectation that he should perform for the masses in his personal time. He was a man of rigid routine and high standards, and the sloppiness of modern life in the 70s, the strikes, the fashion, the casual attitudes, offended his deep-seated conservatism. On set, his demands for proper conduct were legendary and often terrified the junior staff. He refused to engage in what he called undignified behavior. In one famous instance, he flatly refused to remove his trousers for a scene involving a grenade, simply stating, "I do not do slapstick." The writers had to rewrite the scene around his stubbornness. He treated the production runners and assistants with a distant, aristocrat air, rarely learning their names or acknowledging their presence unless they made a mistake. To Arthur Lowe, they were functionaries, the invisible wheels of the machine, not people with whom one made conversation. He expected his tea to be served in a specific way and his schedule to be adhered to with military precision. Anything less was a personal insult. He yearned for the recognition of the establishment, not the applause of the crowd. He desperately wanted a knighthood, believing his contribution to the arts warranted it, and he was reportedly bitter that it never came. He felt that his association with a popular comedy had cheapened his brand, trapping him in the eyes of the public as a figure of fun. He spent the 1970s battling against the very thing that gave him his status, the love of the common people. He died in 1982, a comedy legend who spent his life trying to be taken seriously, never quite understanding that the warmth of the audience was worth more than all the titles and dignity he so frantically chased. Cilla Black. The final story in our collection is perhaps the most heartbreaking because it involves a woman who built her entire career on being one of us. In the 1970s, Cilla Black was the nation's sweetheart, the girl from the cobbled streets of Liverpool with the big voice and the common touch. She was marketed as the friendly girl next door who just happened to be a superstar. Millions of working-class Britons felt a kinship with her, believing that despite the fur coats and the Rolls-Royces, she was still Cilla from the Cavern Club. However, behind the smiles and the catchphrases, a very different reality was forming. As her fame skyrocketed in the 70s, so did her sense of entitlement, and the Liverpool lass began to treat the very people she came from with a cold, steely indifference. The industry insiders knew a Cilla that the public never saw. While she could turn on the charm the second the red light of the camera blinked on, the moment it went off, the warmth evaporated instantly. She was known for refusing to make eye contact with junior staff members. Runners, sound engineers, and makeup artists were often instructed to communicate with her only through her husband and manager, Bobby Willis. He acted as a human shield, filtering out the common rabble so Cilla did not have to lower herself to speak to them directly. This was not just shyness, it was a conscious hierarchy. She had escaped the working-class life, and she seemed terrified of being dragged back down into it by associating with those she now deemed beneath her. Her attitude towards her fans was equally complex and often dismissive. There are countless stories from the 1970s of fans approaching her in airports or hotels, expecting a friendly surprise hello, only to be met with a blank stare or a demand to be left alone. On flights, she famously insisted on sitting in first class while refusing to acknowledge anyone else in the cabin. If a stewardess offered her water or champagne, she would reportedly turn to Bobby and say, "Tell her I do not want it," treating the crew as if they were invisible. It was a display of arrogance that was all the more jarring because it came from someone whose brand was built on approachability and warmth. This disconnect was fueled by her desire to be accepted by the establishment. In the 70s, she moved away from her rock and roll roots and embraced the lifestyle of the landed gentry. She bought a massive country estate, complained about the taxes that paid for the welfare state, and surrounded herself with high society figures. She seemed to resent the fact that her fortune came from the pockets of ordinary people. She wanted the adoration of the masses, but she did not want to interact with them. She treated her fame as a fortress, using her wealth to insulate herself from the grit and grime of the real world. The Arcilla persona became a costume she put on for work, while the real woman became increasingly remote and grand. By the end of the decade, the transformation was complete. The bubbly girl who had once checked coats at the cavern was gone, replaced by a tough, uncompromising businesswoman who demanded the best of everything and had zero patience for incompetence or familiarity. While she remained a national treasure on screen for decades to come, those who encountered her in the real world often walked away feeling cold and disappointed. Her legacy is a complicated one, an undeniable talent and a trailblazer for women in television, but also a stark reminder that sometimes the people we love on screen are nothing like the characters they play. She was the Cinderella who got the castle, but locked the gates to keep everyone else out.